She was once the glittering queen of France, draped in silk and diamonds, ruling over Versailles with unmatched luxury. But in October 1793, she walked barefoot to the guillotine, jeered by the same people who once bowed before her. This is the story of Marie Antoinette, her rise, her fall, and the tragic final days of the beheaded queen. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell for more tales of history's darkest hours. Marie Antoinette was not born in France, but in Austria, Vienna, to be exact on November 2, 1755. She was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of the Habsburg dynasty and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Born into the glittering courts of the Habsburg Empire, she entered the world not as a child free to choose her destiny, but as a pawn in the grand chessboard of European politics. Maria Theresa, a formidable ruler and mother of 16, saw her children as instruments of diplomacy. Sons inherited thrones and armies. Daughters were married off to foreign princes to secure alliances. Marie Antoinette, the youngest daughter, was destined to strengthen Austria's relationship with France, a nation long regarded with suspicion and hostility. At just 14 years old, Marie was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, Louis Auguste, grandson of King Louis XV. The union was celebrated as a bond of peace between two ancient rivals. But beneath the pomp and pageantry lay a chilling truth. She was being sent away from her homeland forever. In 1770, Marie left Austria. As custom dictated, she was stripped of every Austrian possession, even her clothes, and redressed entirely in French garments before being handed over to her new hosts. The message was clear. She was no longer Austrian. She was France's property. On May 16, 1770, she married Louis Auguste in a lavish ceremony at Versailles. She was only 15. He was 16. Both were unprepared for the crown that awaited them. At first, the French public adored her. She was charming, graceful, with a radiant smile that softened her foreign accent. Painters immortalized her as the very image of beauty and youth. But admiration would not last. Life at Versailles was unlike anything Marie Antoinette had known. The palace itself was a world of gold and mirrors, designed to display the majesty of the French monarchy. Every room, every corridor was a performance of power. Etiquette ruled every gesture. Who could sit, who could speak, who could approach the royal couple. For a young queen, Versailles was intoxicating and suffocating. Louis Auguste, her husband, was shy, awkward, and uninterested in court life. He preferred hunting and locksmithing to politics or romance. Their marriage was not consummated for years, a fact whispered and mocked throughout Europe. The absence of heirs cast a shadow over Marie Antoinette's reputation from the start. Lonely and restless, she turned to the pleasures of the court. She adored music, theater, dancing, and above all fashion. Gowns of silk and lace, towering hairstyles adorned with jewels, feathers, even miniature ships. She spent lavishly, often in defiance of her husband's indifference. To escape the rigid ceremonial life of Versailles, she created her own private retreat, the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace within the Versailles grounds. There, she gathered a circle of trusted friends and indulged in plays, masked balls, and gambling. In her hamlet, a model village, she dressed in shepherdess costumes and pretended at simple rural life, while the real peasants of France starved. The public began to notice. Pamphlets circulated in Paris, depicting her as frivolous, vain, and immoral. She was dubbed Madame Deficit, blamed for France's mounting debts, though the true cause was decades of war and financial mismanagement. Still, the image stuck. While peasants went hungry, their queen built theaters, wore diamonds, and played at farming. In the collective imagination of the French people, she became the very symbol of aristocratic indifference. And yet, Marie Antoinette was more complex than the caricature. She loved her children fiercely. She cared deeply for her friends. But her inability or refusal to recognize the suffering outside the palace gates would prove fatal. Versailles was her playground, her prison, and eventually her downfall. By the late 1780s, the glittering facade of Versailles was crumbling. France, once the envy of Europe, was sinking under the weight of its own excesses. Decades of war, particularly support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. Poor harvests left peasants starving. Bread, the staple of French life, became scarce and prohibitively expensive. The gulf between rich and poor, between palace and hovel, grew wider by the day. In 1789, tensions erupted. On July 14th, the Bastille, a prison symbolizing royal tyranny, was stormed by the people of Paris. The French Revolution had begun. The monarchy, once seen as divinely ordained, now looked vulnerable. Rumors spread that the queen hoarded grain, that she plotted with foreign powers, that she bathed in milk while her subjects died of hunger. The press became a weapon. Slanderous pamphlets portrayed Marie Antoinette as a serpent, a harlot, even a witch. She was accused of lesbian affairs, incest, and satanic rituals. Every jewel she wore became evidence of her crimes. Every laugh, a mockery of the poor. But the most damning rumor was that she cared more for Austria, her homeland, than for France. To the revolutionaries, she was not just a frivolous queen. She was a foreign traitor. In October 1789, a mob of women marched from Paris to Versailles, demanding bread. They stormed the palace, slaughtered guards, and forced the royal family to abandon their gilded prison. The king, queen, and their children were escorted to Paris under the watchful eyes of their former subjects. Marie Antoinette's fate was sealed the moment she entered the city. By 1791, the monarchy was hanging by a thread. The royal family was effectively prisoners in the Tuileries Palace, guarded by revolutionary forces. That summer, desperate for escape, the king and queen attempted a daring flight. Disguised, they fled Paris by carriage, hoping to reach the Austrian border and rally loyalist forces. But at the town of Versailles, they were recognized. A postmaster, suspicious of their lavish carriage, alerted the militia. The royal family was arrested and dragged back to Paris in disgrace. The failed escape destroyed whatever trust remained. To the revolutionaries, it proved what they had long suspected. The king and queen were plotting with foreign enemies. To the people, it was betrayal. In 1792, France declared war on Austria and Prussia. The conflict deepened suspicion of the queen. She was called Autrichienne, a pun that meant both the Austrian woman and the Austrian bitch. That same year, the monarchy was abolished. The king was stripped of his titles and put on trial. He was accused of conspiring against the revolution, colluding with foreign powers, and betraying the French people. In January 1793, Louis XVI was found guilty of treason. On January 21st, he was executed by guillotine before a crowd of tens of thousands. His death was greeted with both cheers and tears, an end to centuries of monarchy and the beginning of an uncertain republic. For Marie Antoinette, the fall of her husband was the final blow. She was now the widow caput, a queen without a crown, a foreigner in a land that despised her. And yet, her darkest days still lay ahead. After the execution of Louis XVI, France was no longer a kingdom but a republic. Yet within its borders, the former queen still lived, and for the revolutionaries, her existence was intolerable. Marie Antoinette, now known only as the widow caput, was transferred to the Temple prison in Paris, a medieval fortress turned into a revolutionary jail. Here she would spend the last months of her life, not as a queen, but as a captive. The conditions were harsh. Her cell was damp, the stone walls sweating with moisture from the nearby River Seine. The floor was covered in mud, and water seeped through the cracks. Her bed was nothing more than a folding cot with a thin mattress. Out of pity, sympathetic guards gave her a pillow, a small table, and 2 wooden chairs. Sometimes they purchased bread or water for her with their own money. Yet even in this misery, she tried to hold herself with dignity. She prayed daily, whispered lullabies when she thought of her children, and maintained a regal composure even as her health declined. The loss of her son, Louis Charles, tormented her most. Once regarded as the Dauphin, he was now imprisoned in another part of the temple, cut off from his mother. Revolutionary guards beat and indoctrinated him, forcing him to accuse his mother of vile crimes. His forced testimony would later be used against her in trial. Marie Antoinette cried often, but never in public. Witnesses recalled that in solitude, she would weep for hours, clutching a lock of her son's hair. Yet when she appeared before others, she held her head high, refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her broken. For more than 2 months, she languished in the temple. The revolution was accelerating, the guillotine claiming nobles, priests, and political rivals daily. She knew her time would soon come. On October 14th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The trial was a spectacle, a performance designed to end with her condemnation. The charges against her were sweeping: conspiring with Austria, depleting France's treasury, holding orgies at Versailles, and plotting against the Republic. But one accusation shocked even her accusers. She was charged with incest with her own son, Louis Charles. The courtroom fell silent as the words were read aloud. Marie Antoinette stood frozen, her face pale. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then, gathering her strength, she turned to the jury and declared, "Nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge." The words struck like thunder. Even the hostile crowd was moved. Women in the gallery wept. Others muttered in shame. For all her faults, the Queen's dignity in that moment was undeniable. Still, the outcome was certain. The trial was not meant to seek truth, but to justify execution. Over the next 2 days, witnesses many bribed or coerced painted her as a traitor. Pamphleteers spread lies, and the tribunal fed them to the people like bread at a carnival. On October 15th, after less than 24 hours of deliberation, Marie Antoinette was found guilty of treason. The sentence: death by guillotine. When the verdict was read, she did not cry. She bowed her head, crossed herself, and whispered a prayer. That night, she was returned to her cell. She requested pen and paper, and by candlelight, she wrote her final letter addressed to Elizabeth, the sister of her late husband. It was a letter of farewell. She wrote of her grief for her children, of her hope to face death with courage, of her faith that she would be reunited with her husband in eternity. The letter was never delivered. Guards confiscated it, and it remained hidden for years before being rediscovered. But its words reveal the mind of a woman facing death not as a queen, but as a mother and a wife. Marie Antoinette had been judged. The next morning, she would die. The night before her execution, Marie Antoinette sat alone in her cold cell at the Conciergerie, the infamous antechamber to the guillotine. By flickering candlelight, she took up her pen. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with exhaustion. Months of captivity had ravaged her body. Her hair, once powdered and styled in elaborate towers, had turned white. Her face was pale, her frame gaunt. Yet her mind was clear. She addressed the letter to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law. "I write to you, my dear sister, for the last time. I am condemned, not to a shameful death. I will meet it only as it is. I am going to join your brother. Innocent like him, I hope to show the same firmness in my last moments." She expressed sorrow for leaving her children. "How hard it is to leave them forever, you who love them so much. I entrust them to you. May they one day think of me. Let them know that I die with courage, with the serenity that faith alone can give." She asked forgiveness of all whom she may have offended, and forgiveness from God. It was a letter of grace, sorrow, and resolve. But the world would not see it. Guards confiscated the note, and it was never delivered to Elizabeth. Marie Antoinette spent the remaining hours in silence, kneeling on the stone floor, whispering prayers into the darkness. The morning of October 16, 1793, dawned cold and gray. At 10 a.m., Marie Antoinette was led from her cell. Unlike her husband, who had been driven in a closed carriage, she was forced to ride to the guillotine in an open cart, exposed to the jeering crowd. She wore a plain white gown, her last defiance of vanity. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back. Her once luxurious hair had been shorn short to bare her neck to the blade. As the cart rolled through the streets of Paris, thousands gathered. Some shouted insults, calling her Madame Deficit. Others stared in silence, unnerved by her calm dignity. Witnesses described her as pale but composed, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on the sky. A revolutionary journalist, Jacques Hebert, mocked her as the widow Capet, more dead than alive. But others admitted her courage was undeniable. At Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde, the guillotine loomed, its blade gleaming. She ascended the scaffold slowly. In those final steps, she stumbled and accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Turning to him, she whispered her last recorded words. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." At 11:15 a.m., the blade fell. The crowd roared as her head was lifted high, blood dripping down the executioner's hands. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France, was no more. Her body was unceremoniously thrown into a common grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, covered with lime to hasten decay. No marker, no monument, no crown. Only years later, after the Bourbon monarchy was briefly restored, were her remains and those of Louis XVI exhumed and transferred to the Basilica of Saint Denis, the burial place of French kings. But by then, the legend of Marie Antoinette had already taken root. Some remembered her as a villain, the foreign queen, who mocked the poor with the infamous and likely apocryphal phrase, "Let them eat cake." Others saw her as a victim, a scapegoat for centuries of royal excess, destroyed by forces she could not control. Marie Antoinette remains one of the most polarizing figures in history. To revolutionaries, she was the symbol of everything wrong with monarchy: arrogance, excess, and indifference. To later generations, she became almost romantic, a tragic heroine, crushed by the tides of history. Painters, playwrights, and filmmakers have immortalized her image. Sofia Coppola's 2006 film presented her as a misunderstood teenager, lost in luxury but human at heart. Historians continue to debate, was she truly guilty of betrayal, or simply a woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Perhaps both are true. She was vain, extravagant, careless of appearances. But she was also a mother who loved her children, a wife who stood by her husband to the end, and a queen who faced death with remarkable courage. Her story is not just about diamonds and dresses, but about the fragility of power. One day adored, the next despised. One day crowned, the next condemned. Marie Antoinette's life reminds us that history is not kind to those who fail to see its storms coming. On that October morning, as the blade fell, so too fell the old world of kings and queens. Marie Antoinette's head was severed, but her name has never been silenced. She remains the eternal queen of paradox, at once frivolous and tragic, hated and pitied, guilty and innocent. What do you think? Was Marie Antoinette truly the villain of France's misery, or was she merely a victim of revolution's fury? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more dark tales where history and tragedy intertwine.